Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar titled Introduction to Virtual Engagement for SARTs, Part 2. So we will be sending out recordings of both webinars later this week, but before we get started, we'll do some introductions. My name is Fatima Hayoma. I use she, her pronouns, and I am one of the rural project coordinators at the Sexual Violence Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, also known as SVJI at MNCASA. I provide training and technical assistance and just general support to individuals and teams doing multidisciplinary work in rural areas. And I am here today with Emily Singerhouse.
Hi folks, welcome to the presentation. My name is Emily Singerhouse. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a consultant with MNCASA and founder of Singerhouse Research Consulting LLC. I've been working with MNCASA for the past few years on issues related to sexual exploitation and community engagement. So I'm happy to be chatting here with you all today. And while we're getting started, maybe we can kick us off with a quick little chat where you all put in your name, pronouns, your role, and where you're from, and then maybe even add why you wanted to join today or what brought you in. And I'm going to do some quick housekeeping before we dive into some of the presentation. So Fatima and I are going to be bouncing back and forth today. But I'm going to do a majority of the discussion. And during this presentation, feel free to leverage the chat as much as possible. Add in any reactions that you have to any of the content, throw in some of your thoughts, opinions, or experiences. This is a great space to network with other grantees and really learn from one another. You never know what partnerships might cultivate in a space. Additionally, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat or use the sneaky little Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Fatima will respond during the presentation or we'll take a pause at the end of each section to review some of the questions. And as Fatima said, this will be recorded for you all to refer to after this presentation. And this is part 2 of this 2-part series. So part 1 and part 2 will be uploaded after this one. Additionally, live transcripts are on as well. And if you would like to use them for accessibility, feel free to turn them on. And then lastly here, we will be sending out a questionnaire at the end of the presentation, just to get a little bit of feedback from you all on what you liked, what you didn't like, and see how we can improve for future presentations. So I'm going to pass it back to Fatima.
Really get started, I'm going to quickly talk about our project, which is supported by the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this training are those of the trainers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. Perfect. So now we'll really get started and talk about SVJI at MNCASA. Before I talk about SVJI, I'm going to quickly talk about MNCASA first. MNCASA is a statewide coalition driving transformative culture change to address sexual violence through advocacy, prevention, racial justice, and systems change. The Sexual Violence Justice Institute, also known as SVJI, is a national program operating within the Minnesota Coalition. SVJI works to create long-term sustainable systems responses to sexual violence that meet the specific needs of each community. At our coalition, we operate under 5 values, which are collaboration, integrity, courageous and bold action, prevent harm, and social justice. And what do we do at our coalition? We provide training, support, resources, and connection. Just a quick overview on those 4. factors, we provide training, meaning we do webinars, workshops, conferences, and trainings on special topics. We also create and share resources. So on our website, you'll find templates and fact sheets and blogs and toolkits and guidebooks on SART work. We also provide support, and that's through brainstorming, meeting facilitation, and problem solving. And finally, we are here as a point of connection. So we're here to connect you to experts, whether it be folks in your community or other TA providers in your state or nationally, as well as your peers and mentors.
Excellent, thank you. So as I said before, this is part 2 of our webinar series. So just to give a quick overview of what we did last time, we went over a kind of basic overview of what virtual engagement is. Then we looked a little bit deeper into what virtual engagement can look like in your work. We gave some examples of different strategies and platforms that can be used within this work. And then finally, we went over different ways to set up goals and values to start your virtual engagement strategy. And this was one of the core steps and one of the foundational tips that we try to take away from this last presentation, as this is one of the primary step that should be taken before engaging virtually within SART teams. And so to discuss our presentation for today, we're going to be going over some virtual engagement best practices. So over the course of time, we've kind of collected these tips and tricks that we can share with you all to help you as you start engaging virtually within your teams. Additionally, we're going to be working on capacity and resource building, pinpointing specifically where you can build virtual engagement into your current workload and capacity. So we're going to be doing a really brief activity. And then finally, we're talking about virtual engagement and evaluation to really get that sustained and long-term impacts from virtual engagement. All right, so to get us started then, I'm just going to do a really quick overview of what virtual engagement is and why we use it. So interactions between people or organizations to build relationships or conduct activities is how we view virtual engagement. So it's a relatively new term, but this is in its succinct form. We see virtual engagement as one tool of many that can be supplemented to the toolbox that you're already using to engage with your team, system partners, and community members to accomplish your goals. So truly, this is just a tool, one tool of many that is truly supplemental to your other activities. And so I'm going to start off as well with a quick little poll. So I'm wondering, just to kind of get a pulse, is your SART currently engaging virtually? And Fatima is going to go ahead and start that poll. It should be showing up on your screens here in just a second. And we're going to take a couple of minutes for folks to fill this out. Your options are, yes, I engage all the time. I only engage a little bit, no, not at all. And then what is virtual engagement? I have no idea what that is. So just trying to get some insight on where you're currently at. And if you are engaging virtually, feel free to add into the chat, how effective is virtual engagement within your work? How exactly are you doing that? So would love if somebody would like to supplement their answers within the chat function. And we're going to give it about 20 more seconds or so, and then we're going to close down this poll. All right, so if you haven't submitted your answer, you have just 2 more seconds, and now I'm going to go ahead and end it and show you the results. So we have quite a variety of folks here with us today who are currently engaging, only doing a little bit, some not at all, and some haven't even started yet. So I am very appreciative of all of you for answering this question and sharing where you're currently at within your virtual engagement journey. We're all in very different places, and that is great. So I'm going to stop sharing these results. Awesome. And it looks like we had somebody in the chat as well mention that they use it all the time to engage and mentor SARTs across the state of Alaska, which is a very vast and rural state, or geographically spread out, which virtual engagement can be a very helpful tool to engage with others in that way. So thank you so much for sharing. All right, let's get into it, huh? All right, so virtual engagement best practices. So our first and foremost best practice is to find your people. So to find your people, who does that entail? What does that mean? And when we say find your people, we're talking your audience, your partners, people that you want to spend an impact on, and then also identify who you can help get there. So to do that, you can ask yourself a few simple questions to find out who your people are. So first one being, who are your partners? Who are those folks that your team engages with to conduct the activities and efforts that you're currently doing? And who exactly are you trying to reach with these efforts, with these partners? This helps you hone in who those people are. Next, who needs to see your message? Who is the audience that you want to spread this message to? So for example, if you want to bring awareness to sexual violence, who do you think in your community or partners needs to hear or see that message? And lastly, which virtual engagement platform are they located on? So we have released a blog over SVJI that breaks down these platforms and where people, which different audiences are on different platforms. So feel free to head over to the Real Realities blog to get a little bit more deeper information on this part. But these are some of the 4 foundational questions that can help guide you within finding your people. And next, utilizing hybrid. So I can't stress this enough. Utilizing hybrid is a really unique way to increase consistency, access, flexibility, and reach within your community and team to increase your impact as well. So utilizing a hybrid means that you have people in person and also online. You have 2 different options for folks to choose from based on the needs that they currently have. So some folks love being in person. That's the way that they connect, and that's the most accessible for them. Some folks really enjoy hybrid. That's the way that they are able to attend those meetings or those events and have those conversations. So take a look and see where your team is, where your community is at, and identify where utilizing hybrid could really help. One of the most common methods that we've seen hybrid utilize is within team meetings and other training events as well. So there's the option to join online or the option to be in person. Typically, we've also seen that people have a 90% increase in attendance to events if they have a hybrid option, since most people don't have that initial buy-in to attend events, specifically community members, to attend events that they're not really quite sure about, but would like to attend maybe. And they're most likely to re-attend events by your organization if they have a hybrid option. So that was a really interesting finding that I noticed in the research around this, is how important hybrid can be in increasing that access and reach within different communities. All right, next, consistency. This is a really key piece around virtual engagement, no matter what type of virtual engagement you are participating in. So how exactly does consistency take place in the virtual realm? Well, let's break it down into 3 different options. So first, there's planning. So you can create consistency within your efforts by creating a plan, such as a scope, a timeline, or Gantt chart to outline your goals, your resources, and your purpose for engaging online in whatever capacity you plan to do it in. Next is to strategize. So this relies heavily on referring back to what your current plans are displaying. So you can look into your strategic plans, your work plans, referring back to your mission statements and funding requirements to help strategize the ways in which you hope to engage virtually, to keep that consistent and long-term sustainability within your toolbox. And finally, evaluation. So this is a really key piece of consistency, is being able to understand how to make changes, adapt to different challenges or barriers that your team might face, and to ultimately reach success. So being able to identify the change and then actually make it can really help with consistency. So for example, say you have some turnover within your SART team. How do you keep consistent engagement with your community partners, your community members, and within your team if there's a lot of turnover happening? A really great way to do so is to make an evaluation of what changes need to take place and how you're going to address them, to really keep with the consistent relationship building and response that your team is engaging in. All right, so after hearing a brief overview of some of these best practices for virtual engagement, I'd love to get some feedback on how your SART envisions engaging virtually, given some of the information that we've shared over the course of this project and throughout this presentation so far. So I'm going to open up the chat and see what you all think and how you envision engaging virtually. So for example, are you going to start using hybrid meetings for your quarterly or weekly team meetings? Are you going to be having virtual training options? Do you hope to engage via social media with youth and other system partners, and so on? So we're going to wait a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to just really quick refer to the Q&A as well in case folks have questions. And feel free to use this as much or as little as you would like. The Q&A is a really great way to ask a question, especially if you're not really quite sure about it. You can ask it in an anonymous way, so you don't have to put yourself out there if you don't want to. Ooh, very cool. So one participant said that they're using hybrid for their statewide SART training. That is very cool. You've been full virtual for COVID, like a lot of teams have been as well. And you're going back to in-person in the fall with a hybrid in the spring. Very cool. So I love how you're kind of using multiple different methods to get a feel on how people are engaging within your training. Okay, very cool. So another attendee has said that they've started discussing this as a planning committee, which is a great way to kind of start this foundational virtual engagement journey. They also say that we think that using Zoom primarily with an occasional in-person gathering to help keep people engaged. We also discussed setting up group expectations to keep cameras on so that people feel more engaged. Fatima, how about that? We just talked about this during our last presentation. I really love to see this because this is a huge norm that we try to cultivate within most of our meetings, is to have those group expectations of what it's like to participate in your SART team meetings. So having those cameras on, ensuring that you're speaking up and sharing your opinion and participating in thought discussions, and enjoying the roles and responsibilities of being on your SART team. So it looks like we also have a Q&A as well. So someone says that we're just starting our hybrid monthly meetings and they're worried that we will not be able to keep them engaged, that the meetings will become stagnant. It's a really great question. So when it comes to hybrid meetings, a way to keep people engaged on both sides of the camera, both virtually and in person, is to have a rotating order in which folks speak during the meeting, that for every agenda item or breakout room or whatever it may be, there is an order in which folks speak. So for example, it could be by discipline, depending if you have a really, really large team. It could be by individual as well. And so, for example, if you are starting, let's say a case study on the effects of your SART team in your community since you've started, you could have an ongoing rotation for the way that folks participate to get engagement from both sides without having that kind of awkward, like, I don't really know if I should talk right now because somebody in person might be talking, or vice versa. Another great way that we've recommended folks to keep engagement going is by having roles designated to each person for the meeting, whether that's gathering the agenda, taking notes, ensuring that we're keeping time, like the timekeeper, somebody who calls on folks, and so on. There's we're going to be releasing a micro learning here in the next month to help describe different methods that SARTs can use to keep engagement during meetings, trainings, and other webinars. So I hope this answered your question. Feel free to add if you have any more clarification on this piece, but yeah. Adam, is there anything that you'd like to add to any of these comments or questions that we've gotten?
Yeah, I think similar to what you said, we have some really wonderful resources coming up to hopefully help facilitate engagement virtually, but also provide you with new ideas or tools for how to engage folks both in that hybrid space where you are in person and also virtual. So expect some really great tools this coming fall.
All right, awesome. Yes, love a good hype for our upcoming resources, which will be shared virtually, of course. All right, so we're going to move on to our next section here, which includes a little activity to get us going. So we're going to be talking about capacity in resource building. And so as we start to think about this, I'm going to bring up a topic that we touched on last time, but it is also good to remind folks of something called technology readiness, also sometimes known as the generation gap, but I align a little bit more with the ideas of technology readiness. This means different levels of ability and comfort to use or adopt technology within your efforts. So as a SART, there's definitely a lot of different ways for all of us to connect in our own way. And that can look like building off of what's already in place. So for example, if there's already different protocols for how folks engage online, whether that's through Zoom or Teams, build off of that from somebody's comfortability level to keep engaging and going beyond that. Next, lead into others. If you need some help figuring out different ways to engage people in ways that they feel more comfortable, or if you would like to lean into others to learn more about how to engage in a way that you feel most comfortable. Next, if you are leading a SART or providing TA to a SART, provide a variety of different options for people to connect so that you meet them where they are and they don't feel pressured or and feel like they have to connect in only one way. The best way to get people to engage is to provide a variety of different options. And last one here, remembering your values. So thinking back to our last webinar, what are those values that you outlined? What are the values of your SART? And really try to listen to those and hone in on those. A lot of them are community-based, victim-centered, trauma-informed. Accessibility is a huge one. So really try to remember those values as you start engaging virtually and going in different efforts that you might not have before COVID. COVID-19 really has changed the way that we are interacting with one another. So it's important to kind of remember what your values are as you start adapting the ways that your SARTs engage with others. All right, Fatima, is there anything that I'm missing with this piece here?
I don't think so. I believe you have that covered. But just to reiterate what Emily said, this is just something we like to mention up front, that there is so many ways that we can all connect with one another, including in virtual spaces.
Yes, absolutely. And that does not ignore that there are ways to connect in person as well. So really trying to provide that option to have that in-person connection or virtual connection, depending on what folks prefer. All right, so let's get into capacity assessments for virtual engagement. So this is a way that you can help identify the different avenues in which you can work virtual engagement into your current capacity. So this is one of the greatest barriers that we learned from the grantees through our roundtable discussions that we did during the spring. We hosted 3 roundtables chatting with grantees who chatting with SARTs and trying to understand the needs, barriers, strengths, and resources that they all have and how we can better help create resources and support and tools for you all to use. And capacity was one of the largest barriers that we learned about. So we're spending a little bit of time here to dive into different ways that we can help increase that for you, or maybe not increase, but enhance and partner with it. All right, so that can look like assessing your staffing, your current processes and protocols, the resources available to you, and then also your leadership. So now it's your turn. So we're going to be walking through an activity. So this activity is based on what are the elements of your capacity building. So what we're going to do is encourage you all to get a piece of paper, a Word document, a Google document, some sticky notes, whatever it is, to take a note of the following slides. So this is essentially what we're trying to create for you all. So you're going to have 4 different sections of your notes, 1 for staffing, 1 for processes, 1 for resources, and 1 for leadership. So if you outline 3 answers within each category, you are going to then assess these categories and figure out where capacity can intertwine with virtual engagement. We'll walk through the whole thing with you. Don't worry. But your job right now is to get out a piece of paper and a pen or your clicky clackies on the computer to start taking notes on this piece here. Okay. Any questions or thoughts before we move on? Fatima, is there anything that we're missing to describe what we're about to do?
I don't think so. I think we just give folks a couple of minutes and should be ready to go.
Okay, fantastic. Again, we're going to be asking, what are the elements of your capacity building? So I'm going to wait about 10 or 15 more seconds, and we're going to dive into the activity together. All right, fantastic. So to start off with staffing, you can start asking yourself the following questions. How much time do you or your team currently spend on virtual engagement activities? Are you spending, 1 minute to 2 hours every week on virtual engagement activities? Are you using Zoom for your meetings? Are you doing newsletters every month? Are you engaging on social media? How much time are you currently contributing to do virtual engagement efforts? And for those who aren't currently engaging online, what do you want to spend on virtual engagement efforts? What's the ideal number of time or hours or minutes or days, whatever it may be for you? How much time do you ideally want to spend on virtual engagement? And then you can write that down within your notes here. Next, does your team discuss virtual engagement topics during meetings? Pretty simple, straightforward. Is this currently a topic within conversation? And you can write yes, no, within your notes. And feel free to take notes of these questions as well, so you can refer back to them. We will be sharing this out after the presentation, but it's good to kind of have this on hand for you. All right. And thinking about your team as a whole, in the past year, has your team included virtual engagement within your work? So where has it kind of shown up in conversation? How has any efforts taken place? Have there been any decisions on if you're going to continue doing virtual engagement or start? Somebody said in the chat, they're starting to talk about it in a planning committee. So this is kind of where you're going to start identifying these staffing pieces here. Okay. Next, to what extent has it been difficult to get the right people to join in on these efforts? So how has it been difficult? Has it been even successful, if that's been your case, to get the right people involved in engaging virtually? Fatima, is there anything that you would like to add to this one here on maybe some examples for folks to think about?
Yeah, I would just say something to think about as you're thinking about your capacity to do this work within your organization is to think about your mission and vision as a SART and what folks signed in for when they maybe signed the MOUs to join your SART. So that's something to keep in mind. We talked about this a little bit in the first presentation, but think about the purpose, or as we're going to talk about later, the why your SART exists, and figure out how virtual engagement is also tied with that.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so next we're moving on to the processes. What are the processes and protocols that are currently existing within your SART? So are there any ongoing trainings or professional development utilized for engagement? For example, one could say this webinar is a great training or professional development experience for you to kind of build your ability to start using virtual engagement. Have there been any other activities or resources shared with you and your team similar to this or other tools that you could utilize to learn more about virtual engagement? All right, next, to what extent is virtual engagement including your strategic planning documentation? Is it not included at all? You don't plan on using it? It's not in your strategy? Or are you trying to work it into your strategic planning on how you hope to accomplish your goals for the next year? So for example, are you going to be using these Zoom trainings? Are you going to be using like Google Drive to share your documents? Are you going to be using social media to engage with youth leaders, community partners, etc.? So to what extent is this going to be supplemented within your strategic planning? And if it's not, this is a great place to identify that, so you can see different ways within your strategic plan that virtual engagement can enhance what you're already doing or add to it in some way. Right? In your opinion, how satisfied is the team with your ongoing engagement efforts? So thinking about your current processes of how you're already doing your engagement with community or your community partners and other agencies or organizations, how is your team currently feeling about this? Are they satisfied with the way things are going? Do they feel that there's going to be a need for a change? Are there people that you're missing within your current engagement efforts? So to identify this piece is going to be really key in figuring out how your team can support you within this effort to engage virtually. All right, next, who are your current partners to assist with these practices and processes? So is there anybody within your team or within your community that is a partner to assist you in ongoing practices and processes or starting new ones? All right. Fatima, is there anything that you would add to this one?
So something to think about, as Emily mentioned, like these trainings that we, for example, are doing today, they are recorded. So I've heard some SARTs already, or I received an email that was saying, will this be recorded? Because I want to show this to my team during a meeting. So even though you are the primary grantee, you're welcome to also share the resources you receive from SVJI with members of your team. Additionally, when thinking about including virtual engagement in your work, there's certainly plenty of ways to incorporate it into your work. So even if this isn't part of your current team's goals or your mission, even there's certainly work that you can do to incorporate this more into the work of your SART. As Emily mentioned earlier, COVID has certainly changed a ton, and a lot of us kind of had to fumble and learn how to do virtual engagement work suddenly. But now we're really at a time where we can slow down a bit and see and be more intentional with our virtual work. So these are just like great questions to think about as you're beginning this process.
That's a great point, Fatima. What you mentioned at the end there is about intentionality and really trying to examine the different processes. So you are coming in with intention and value to make a sustainable impact using this tool. So next we're going to dive into resources that you currently have. So in the last year, was there any money or funding that was allocating to coordinating / planning engagement methods? So for example, did you have a grant that helped assist you with engaging with your community members? Was there something that helps give you planning resources or anything like that? Pretty simple. Was there any funding currently allocated to your engagement methods? Next, has your team applied for any funding to help increase engagement and reach within your community, within your team, or with your system partners? And then thinking about next year, how much money or funding, or I guess resources in general, will be allocated to increasing engagement methods? So is there anything that you're currently trying to contribute to increase what you're already doing? And it says the dollar sign on here, but really that can be anything, whether that's time, funding, volunteers, printing resources, whatever it may be, any sort of investment that will be allocated to increasing these engagement methods. And then next, who are those partners, i.e. the folks that you would be investing with in the community that can be leveraged for sharing leadership over engagement? So partners are a great resource to you to help share in the leadership of your SART response. It takes a village to address violence and respond to it in a way that is appropriate and respectful to all victims. And so to share that leadership is going to be really important. Can't just be one person, it has to be the community as a whole coming together. So who does that look like for your team? All right, I'm going to move on to the next one here, unless Fatima, you have anything you'd like to add for this piece?
I think for this piece, funding is a really big thing for SARTs. And as we know, there are funded and unfunded teams. For folks that are currently funded, I highly just recommend checking out what your funding source is and connecting with your funder, whether that's a grant manager or TA provider. They would be able to assist you in figuring out how you can fund this virtual engagement work. In the state of Minnesota, we're fortunate enough to be able to fund quite a few teams and provide resources for them around virtual engagement. For example, during COVID, we were able to purchase Zoom accounts for certain teams who requested it, or we were able to purchase tools and equipment for teams to be able to meet in virtual spaces. So wherever you are, please do feel free to either connect with SVJI or connect with your state coalitions to figure out what funding is available in your communities. If you're unsure of who your state coalition TA provider is, feel free to reach out to us always. And as grantees, we're always happy to provide, or as your TA provider, we're happy to provide you with the support you need in connecting you to the right folks.
Excellent. Thank you. That was great. All right. So last piece here is leadership. So how much support for engagement efforts are supported by leadership compared to other members? So how much do you support engagement efforts compared to other members? So for example, how much time and effort do you spend doing engagement compared to other members of your team? And what does that actually look like for you? So are you the only person that's doing engagement? Is there another member on your team that's the only one doing engagement with your community? So sometimes teams are split up into different work groups. What do those smaller work groups look like? Is this only being held by one person, or is it being held by many? So trying to think about how that looks. Next, how much of a priority is virtual engagement compared to other priorities? So this is a really key question here on trying to understand the ways that capacity can be integrated with virtual engagement is by seeing how much of a priority it is compared to others. So is it important to you and to your SART to make sure that you do have different ways for people to access your meetings, to come to your trainings, and to get feedback from the community and so on? So it's just trying to kind of put into perspective what type of priority this is, so you can allocate as much resources or time or effort to it as you see fit. Next, how well do you understand virtual engagement as a tool for engagement? So is this saying that you need to reach out to others to help share this with you? Or are you feeling pretty good that you understand virtual engagement as a tool that you can use within your toolbox of many other strategies that you interact with? Does that make sense? I feel like I kind of said that in a little bit of a weird way. All right, so last question here with leadership. Who would be the leaders in implementing virtual engagement methods? Would that be your SART team leader? Would that be advocacy, law enforcement, healthcare? But who is that going to be to kind of take this on and say, hey, let's start integrating this into our efforts? What is that going to look like? So I'm going to wait a couple of seconds here before we move on to the next piece, where we're going to start sharing out some of these elements that you took note on. And while we wait for a second for folks to finish up their notes here, Fatima, is there anything that you'd like to add to this leadership piece?
Yeah, so sharing leadership is one of the things we talk about the most probably at SVJI. But basically, when integrating a new tool, it's really important that you as SART coordinators and SART leaders are checking in with your team. You might find someone in your team that's super interested in virtual engagement and really excited by it. They could then be one of the leaders in the subcommittee or small group within your SART that could be leading this work.
Yes, absolutely. So kind of finding those strength pieces within your team to help share the leadership within this effort. Shouldn't be a burden. It should be something that excites you and enhances what you're already doing. All right, so time for us to share out. Let's hit it in the chat. What are some of the elements of your capacity building? Within your staffing that you identified, what are some elements that you wrote down? What about your processes, your resources, or your leadership? What did you all write down within your capacity building plan? So for example, feel free to share with us if there's anybody in your team or a discipline that you're going to help rely on to do these efforts with. Are there any resources that you are going to leverage to help integrate into your capacity? So we're going to spend just a couple of seconds here. And if you have questions as well about this, feel free to drop those into the Q&A or the chat. If you need help pinpointing some more capacity building, we're happy to do that as well. If you want us to go back a few slides, we can also do that. My apologies that we don't have the recording function, or I'm sorry, not recording, the unmute function up for this, because we would totally invite you to unmute, but we have the chat here for you all today. So feel free to add that in. We're just going to wait a couple of seconds, maybe about a minute or two for folks to add into the chat. I just put some examples in the chat as well to prompt you all. And if you don't feel like sharing out, that's totally fine too. But I just want to make sure this is beneficial to you all. So if you have questions that might make this help be a little bit easier for you, feel free to add those in the chat, put them in the Q&A. We're here to make this accessible for you. It's something that you can use beyond just this presentation. We want you to have, those 4 categories that you can take with you and say, hey, let's take a look at these items here with your team. So whatever we can do to help you with that, let us know. And it looks like somebody put in their chat here that they're currently leading their SART alone. So they're looking for other leaders to help with engagement, and that would be really beneficial to them. That's a really great point that a lot of SARTs are also faced with one leader facilitating and hosting the team. So it's great to have a co-host and co-facilitator to help share some of the efforts that you are taking on. Assuming leading a SART isn't your only role, so it's good to have somebody else that you can rely on to conduct these activities with. All right, so looking at the time, I think I'm going to keep going. Fatima, is that okay with you? Should we spend a little bit more time? Okay. We're going to keep on moving, but if you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share, toss them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, you know the drill. All right, so now let's think about how to actually utilize this going forward. So it looks like really quick before we keep going, I did get a question in the Q&A. Somebody said that they weren't thinking about needing funding to run a SART, but this is an objective under the OVW grant. So they allocated funds for them to work with a sexual assault organization and compensate their engagement. Wow, that's awesome. But they're curious about what other things they might need to budget in the future. That's a fantastic question. Fatima, is there anything off the top of your head that you want to make sure you mention?
Yeah, like you said, that is really great that you're able to compensate that organization's time to be able to participate in your SART. Some things we've seen folks budget into their work has been education components. So having funding to bring trainers in for their SART work. That's been a really big thing we've seen a lot of folks use, whether it's virtual or in person, making sure we have the funding to support those in our community who are providing us with resources. Additionally, I've seen folks also make sure that they have funding to be able to compensate survivors that they're working with as they're doing SART work. So things like that, as well as technology. So if your team is looking to be hybrid for who knows how long when, or if your team is planning to be completely virtual, making sure that you have funding to support that work. So that could be having a Zoom account that can go over 40-minute meetings, having Zoom accounts that can host multiple folks. And so that's just some examples. I know some teams have also sought funding for microphones, making sure that they're able to communicate effectively. So, yeah, and if you have any other questions, please do reach out to us at SVJI, and we'd be happy to draft some ideas with you.
Yes, and to add off of that as well, consider the current platforms and technology that you're utilizing to share your notes and your documents and other materials that you have as a team. How exactly are you planning your timelines, task management, etc.? So I would encourage folks to also look into having, one central location for their files, whether that's through Google, SharePoint, OneDrive, whatever it may be, that fits within your policies as within organizations and with states and all that jazz. I love Basecamp as a great alternative for managing projects and teams. It's a great resource along with like Asana and stuff like that. Just look into some of the platforms that might help supplement the work that you're doing. And some of those can be included within your budget if your team decides that that's something that's good for you. All right. And we did touch on that a little bit on our past presentation, so feel free to refer back to that too if you want a little bit more insight. Okay, so how to actually utilize some of these questions and answers that you just pinpointed over the last few slides. So what we just kind of did was that capacity assessment, which was assessing what your current capacity is and how you can grow from it. So it wasn't a full on like, this is what we're doing, but it's a more brief and something that can be used widely across teams. So how to actually understand what you're going to use within this assessment is to understand what some of the weaknesses are. What are your current resources? What are your strengths? And where is the energy and passion most concentrated within your efforts? And then where can you find room for growth or to fill in some gaps? So these are some foundational questions to help you understand the past few slides and where you can pinpoint to increase your capacity. All right, next is to create your strategic plan. So briefly, this looks like having a timeline, identifying those partners, the roles and responsibilities of members within your team, and what goals and outcomes you hope to have as you have your SART and within the efforts that you hope to conduct both virtually and in person. So make sure you have that timeline, partners, roles and responsibilities, and then goals and outcome to create that strategic plan that you can incorporate these virtual engagement efforts into. All right, next I'm going to pass it over to Fatima for this last part. So implementing the plan.
Perfect. Yeah, so implementing the plan. So starting is the hardest part. So like everything relating to SART work, it is a long process. As we talked about in part 1 and the activity we just did, there are a lot of things you have to figure out, including your audience, message, platform, etc. So it is hard and it's a long process, but in the end, being intentional about virtual engagement work is really important. 2, remember that everyone makes mistakes. So like we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar and in part 1, virtual engagement is really a new tool. So meaning that mistakes will be made. When that happens, it's really important to be able to evaluate the work that's been done and make improvements. So this has been very similar to our 3 phases of systems change. You're assessing the status quo, you're making change, and then you're evaluating, which we'll actually talk about in the next couple of slides. And then 3, get youth involved. So it is really important to have your community involved, and that includes youth. They are wonderful resources and can be great for learning how to engage virtually. And then 4, remember your why. So remember your purpose as a SART and why you want to engage in this work. So we talked a lot about this as we were developing these webinars and also the resources we've developed over the last few months. But think about the purpose of your SART, why you exist as a SART, and why you want to continue engaging in this work.
And to build off of that as well, remember the why for other partners within your work too. Why are they a part of this team? Is there something that keeps them going, trying to figure out what is that thing that makes them tick for this work? Is going to be really helpful as you start implementing your virtual engagement. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next section here. This one is virtual engagement evaluation. So one of my favorite parts about the work that we do is evaluation. So we're going to start off this section with a quick little poll, trying to get a pulse on how familiar you currently are with evaluation. So some of the options that you have to answer: you're an expert in evaluation, you know it front and back, you can do it in your sleep. Next, you can be pretty familiar with it. You're neither an expert nor you're not totally unknown. You're somewhat familiar and you're not really sure what evaluation means, which is totally fine as well. So we're going to spend just about 30 more seconds to a minute on this. We're waiting for folks to participate in this poll, and then we're going to share it out to you all. So this is going to be a helpful section for not only your virtual engagement work, but your SART work as a whole. It's good to kind of come back and be grounded in evaluation, as this helps increase and improve your efforts now and in the future. It's also a great way to get buy-in from your community members to participate in your SART and to support you in the efforts that you're doing. It's also a great way to show the impact of your efforts as well. So who have you reached? Have there been any changes in behaviors or opinions or attitudes by your efforts? Has there been any numbers that have come out of this? Are there any counts? So this evaluation is a really great way to ground you in your work. So I'm going to end the poll now and share it out. And it looks like we have a pretty mixed bag here. So we have some people that are pretty familiar, some people who are somewhat familiar, and some who don't really quite know what it is. So this next section is going to be really great for all of you. And I am going to stop sharing now. Okay, excellent. So what is evaluation? So that is the process to critically examine or understand efforts by collecting information about the different activities, characteristics, and outcomes of your efforts. The purpose of this is to understand the efforts, their effectiveness, and to plan for the future. So evaluation is typically a term that can sometimes scare people, but it doesn't have to be so scary. We can really break it down into two simple categories. So one is process, and the next is impact. These are the two types of evaluation that we're going to talk about today. So first, process, that is something that is measuring if the activity or event was delivered as planned. Did everything happen the way that you wanted it to? Making sure that it's reaching the intended audiences and then producing the desired outcomes. So these are things like trackers, attendance counts, knowing how many flyers you passed out, who came to your presentation, how did it go, were there any technology issues or comments that people gave you. Next is impact. This discusses the effectiveness of your efforts, measures the change in knowledge, beliefs, or perspectives from your efforts, and then if they were successful and implemented in the way that they were supposed to. So, for example, in virtual engagement, process and impact can look like updated MOUs. Since you've started engaging virtually, have there been any new partners that have decided to sign an MOU with you? Are you able to reach more people? Next, analytics tracking. So if you're deciding to engage on social media, you have the ability to track the amount of people that you reach, how many likes it gets, etc. So you can really get those finer details from social media and other analytics such as attendance during your meetings. And then next, has there been any staffing changes? So what's been going on within your team, and trying to track those just like changes over time. Another way to track your process through evaluation is through different methods and tools or trainings. What's been happening? What have you increased or decreased? Just taking note of that. Next, for impact in virtual engagement, you can measure your evaluation, or I'm sorry, evaluation can measure the impact of your virtual engagement efforts through things like surveys. You could give a virtual survey or send it to people that you engage with virtually to kind of get an idea on how your efforts might have changed their behaviors or opinions, if they have any feedback for you. And next is focus groups and interviews. This can be done in a virtual way, in an in-person way, but really trying to gather with other people how your SART is doing, and if there's any way for it to be improved, or to get into some finer details around your community. So virtual engagement can be measured through this way as well. And next is an assessment of the tools that you've done. So for example, how well is your social media journey been going? How are your Zoom meetings going? Just trying to kind of get an idea on, are those tools impacting others in the way that they were meant to? All right, Fatima, is there anything that you'd like to add for the evaluation piece here around process or impact? Any other examples that we should bring up that they could use?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Some examples. I would say, like, in addition to thinking about surveys and focus groups, making sure that you're also, as a SART, always reaching out to survivors in your community as well. And we kind of talked about this in the last few slides, but when you're asking for feedback from survivors, to also make sure that you're compensating survivors and the folks you're asking to complete or do any type of evaluation in your work. So that's just something to really think about when you're doing that. Additionally, as we know, there's a lot of staffing changes within our movement. So making sure that the work we're doing, whether it's protocol work or virtual engagement work, making sure that we're embedding it really into our work as a SART. So once staff members leave, or members within a SART leave, that information is then passed on to new folks.
That's a really great point there, is just to kind of keep that tracking for the historical context. Due to turnover, it's really easy to lose information, to lose evaluation numbers, passwords, documents, whatever it may be. But kind of keeping in mind the processes to have almost that paper trail per se. So this piece here, virtual engagement for evaluation, can be really helpful to evaluate the way your SART is as well. So if you want to understand the impact of your SART, you can use virtual engagement to evaluate that through online surveys and focus groups, and vice versa. You can use surveys and focus groups to evaluate the impact that virtual engagement has had within your SART. So it can kind of go back and forth, but this is part of that 3 ways of change. I believe that's what it's called, the three processes of change.
3 phases of systems change.
Yes, the 3 phases of systems change. Thank you. The making the change, assess the status quo, make the change, and then, oh my goodness, I had this down yesterday. I'm so sorry. Evaluation, yes, of course. So this is part of this effort of systems change. Try to integrate this where you can. Virtual engagement, as we said, is a tool to help you supplement all the other tools that you're doing. So definitely try to keep this in mind. All right, so we're wrapping up here. We're going to end off on a little chat here. So what are you going to take away from this moving forward? How will you start your engagement? And we're also going to spend the next 10 or 12 minutes as well, opening it up for questions for folks. If you have anything that you want to pose to us, we are here for you. So something that I'm taking away from this webinar series is how fantastic of a host Fatima is. I just want to say thank you so much for being a great co-host and support throughout these presentations. She's a great resource for you all to lean on, so feel free to contact her if you have any questions or need any form of support. That's my big takeaway from this.
And similar to Emily, Emily is a wonderful resource and is providing support for us for a few months now. So as we're closing kind of this project, if you have any questions regarding virtual engagement work or any of the presentation materials from today, please do feel free to reach out to us, and I'll get you connected to Emily and we'll come up with a resource or some type of brainstorming strategy to help you really incorporate virtual engagement into your work.
Awesome. So just a quick overview of what we have coming up. We've got a micro learning coming up on how to increase engagement within virtual meetings. We also have an infographic resource coming out, and these 2 webinars as well to help support you. And thanks to the folks who've commented, some things that they're taking away is working on communication around SART members and to not so heavily fall back on the coordinator. So it looks like we're leaning into some of that shared leadership, which is awesome. And then somebody else is taking away how to better engage their SART team and make them more accountable. That's a huge piece in keeping people engaged within your team, is holding them accountable for their roles and responsibilities within the team and what they hope to take away from it. So I'm going to put our emails on the slide now. So here is how you can reach out to us. I'm going to put our emails in the chat. And Fatima and I are going to hang out here for the next 10 minutes in case folks have questions.
And I want to say thank you to Emily for facilitating webinar 1 and 2 virtual engagement work. Like I mentioned in the beginning, these webinars have been recorded and we will send them out to folks sometime at the end of this week or early next week. In the chat, I also put a few links down. One is a link to our website in which you'll find various tools and resources, like I mentioned in the beginning. I also dropped a link to our blog. There you will find 4 blogs that Emily has written around virtual engagement work. And finally, I also dropped a link to our SurveyMonkey. So this is our first time doing this virtual engagement webinar series. So we would love feedback on how to do this work, or how we've done this work over the last few months and also these webinars. So feel free to provide us any feedback you might have. And again, thank you, Emily, for facilitating these webinars. Emily's dropped our emails in the chat as well. So as always, if you have any training or technical assistance needs, please reach out to us at SVJI.